They say, heroes often come from the most unlikely places, and today's story proves that true in the most dramatic way. It all began on an ordinary afternoon at a busy café, a place where the smell of fresh coffee mingled with the hum of casual chatter. Patrons were lost in their routines, blissfully unaware that something dark was brewing right in their midst. In one corner of the café sat Mr. Langston, a billionaire known for his success and refined tastes. He was the picture of composure, savoring a quiet moment in his day. But just as his hand reached for the steaming cup in front of him, a voice rang out. "Don't touch that." The shout was sharp, almost startling, and all eyes turned toward its source. A small boy, no older than 10, standing at the doorway. His clothes were worn, his face marked by the struggles of life on the streets. At first glance, he didn't look like someone you'd pay attention to. But in that moment, his words carried a weight that silenced the entire café. What could he have possibly seen that no one else noticed? Why would a boy like him risk shouting across a room filled with strangers? This was no ordinary interruption. What followed was a chilling discovery, a confrontation that left everyone speechless, and an unforgettable act of bravery that turned this small boy into an unlikely hero. Stick around, because this is a story that will keep you hooked until the very last second. Let's dive in and uncover what really happened that fateful day. The city hummed with life as the afternoon sun cast a golden glow on the bustling streets. Inside a cozy café, tucked between towering buildings, the scene was serene yet lively. Patrons sipped coffee, flipped through newspapers, and chatted with friends. Among them was Mr. Langston, a man whose name was synonymous with success. He was the kind of person who drew attention without trying. His tailored suit, polished demeanor, and reputation as a billionaire made him stand out in any crowd. At his usual corner table, he sat with an air of confidence. A steaming cup of premium coffee rested in front of him, alongside a carefully plated dessert that he treated himself to every Thursday afternoon. It was his brief escape from a life of endless meetings and high-stakes decisions. Meanwhile, just across the street, another life played out in stark contrast. Tyler, a young boy no older than 10, sat on the cold sidewalk. His clothes were tattered, his face smudged with dirt, and his small frame hinted at days of missed meals. Yet there was something sharp in his gaze. Tyler wasn't idly watching the world pass by, he was observing it, analyzing every movement with a street-smart intuition that only someone like him could possess. His attention shifted to the café. Among the flurry of activity, one table caught his eye, Mr. Langston's. It wasn't the billionaire's wealth or stature that drew Tyler's focus. No, it was something far more unsettling. A man in a sharp suit stood nearby, pretending to adjust his cufflinks as he glanced around the room. He leaned slightly toward Mr. Langston's table, his hand moving so quickly it might have been missed by anyone else. But not by Tyler. The man slipped something into Mr. Langston's drink, a motion so subtle it could have been mistaken for nothing at all. Tyler's pulse quickened. He didn't know who Mr. Langston was or why someone hurt him, but every instinct he had screamed that something was wrong. He had seen plenty during his time on the streets, enough to recognize when danger was unfolding. The boy's heart raced as he debated what to do. Speak up, and he risked being ignored or even thrown out. Stay silent, and the consequences could be catastrophic. Tyler didn't have the luxury of second-guessing himself. Across the room, the man in the suit walked away as if nothing had happened, blending effortlessly into the crowd. Mr. Langston reached for his cup, completely unaware of the shadow looming over what should have been an ordinary moment. Tyler's time to act was running out. What would you have done in his shoes? Tyler's decision was one that would not only define his character, but also set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. Don't touch that. Tyler's voice pierced the café like a bolt of lightning. The hum of conversations, the clinking of cups, and the shuffling of papers all came to an abrupt halt. It was as if someone had pressed pause on the world. Every pair of eyes turned toward the small boy standing near the entrance, his outstretched finger trembling as it pointed straight at Mr. Langston's table. Mr. Langston froze mid-motion, his hand hovering over the cup of coffee. For a man who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without flinching, the sheer urgency in Tyler's voice stopped him cold. He looked at the boy, puzzled yet intrigued. "Are you talking to me?" Mr. Langston asked, his voice calm but tinged with curiosity. Tyler nodded frantically, his messy hair bouncing as he did. His wide eyes darted between the cup and Mr. Langston's face. "Yes. Don't drink it. Please, sir, you have to believe me." The air in the room grew heavy with tension. The cafe staff exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment play out. Meanwhile, the other patrons leaned closer to their tables, their whispers buzzing like restless bees. "Who is this kid?" one man muttered. "What's his deal?" another woman whispered. And then, breaking the awkward silence, someone quipped, "Well, this definitely isn't on the menu." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, but they were quickly swallowed by the overwhelming sense that something serious was happening. Mr. Langston furrowed his brow, looking at Tyler with a mix of skepticism and intrigue. "You've got my attention, kid," he said. "What's going on?" Tyler hesitated, his small chest rising and falling as he caught his breath. "I saw him," he said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "The man in the suit. He put something in your drink, I swear." The room collectively held its breath. A man in the back cleared his throat nervously, while a waitress fumbled with her notepad. All eyes were on Mr. Langston as he stared at Tyler, trying to gauge whether the boy was telling the truth or just looking for attention. But there was something in Tyler's tone, a raw, unfiltered desperation that couldn't be faked. He wasn't just making a scene. He was trying to save a life. Mr. Langston leaned back slightly, his sharp mind piecing together the situation. He glanced at the untouched cup, the warm steam still curling into the air. Then he turned back to Tyler, his expression unreadable. "You're saying someone tried to poison me?" he asked, his voice low and measured. Tyler nodded again, his hands clutching the edges of his worn shirt. "Yes, sir, I saw it. You can't drink that." For a moment, the cafe seemed suspended in time, the weight of Tyler's words hanging heavy over the room. The question on everyone's mind was the same. Was the boy telling the truth, or had they just witnessed a wild misunderstanding? No one could have guessed what was about to unfold. What began as an ordinary afternoon had now become a scene of life-or-death stakes, and the next move would reveal just how much courage and truth was behind Tyler's warning. Mr. Langston leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes narrowing as he shifted his gaze between the trembling boy and the untouched cup of coffee. He tapped his fingers lightly on the table, his expression a mix of curiosity and doubt. "All right, kid," he said, his voice calm but edged with skepticism. "Why shouldn't I drink it?" Tyler shifted nervously on his feet, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes in the room. He was used to being ignored, overlooked, and dismissed. And now? Now he had to convince a room full of strangers that he wasn't just making it all up. He took a deep breath, steadying his voice. "I saw him," Tyler said, pointing directly at a man in a tailored suit standing near the back of the cafe. "That man over there, he put something in your drink when you weren't looking." The cafe erupted into gasps and murmurs, the patrons craning their necks to get a better look at the accused. The man in question froze, his hand still clutching a half-eaten sandwich. His face turned a shade paler as every head swiveled in his direction. "What's this nonsense?" the man stammered, his voice rising an octave. He held up his hands defensively, his polished cufflinks catching the light. "I don't even know this boy. He's making it up." A waitress near the counter dropped her tray with a loud clatter, her wide eyes darting between the billionaire and the boy. Mr. Langston, still remarkably composed, turned his attention back to Tyler. "That's a serious accusation," he said evenly. "Do you have any proof?" Tyler swallowed hard. "Proof? What kind of proof could he offer?" I saw him do it," he insisted, his voice trembling. He looked around to make sure no one was watching, but I was. "I saw him sprinkle something into your cup before walking away like nothing happened." The tension in the room thickened like a storm cloud. Mr. Langston tilted his head, studying Tyler carefully. "And why were you watching me?" he asked, his tone sharp but not unkind. Tyler hesitated. How could he explain it without sounding strange? "I wasn't watching you exactly," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I was watching people. I do it a lot. You notice things when no one notices you." For a moment, the cafe was silent except for the hum of the espresso machine in the background. Tyler's words seemed to hang in the air, cutting through the doubt like a blade. Mr. Langston's gaze shifted to the man in the suit, who was now edging closer to the door. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, commanding tone. The man straightened his tie nervously, a sheen of sweat glistening on his brow. "This is ridiculous," he barked, his voice louder now, almost angry. "I'm a respectable businessman. You're really going to take the word of some street kid over mine?" And that's when someone whispered loudly, "Well, this just got better than my Netflix subscription." The patrons chuckled nervously, but their laughter quickly faded as Mr. Langston stood up. His towering frame seemed even more imposing as he walked toward the cup of coffee on the table. He stared at it for a long moment before turning back to the suited man. "Respectable businessman or not," he said, his voice calm but icy, "if this kid is lying, we'll know soon enough. But if he's telling the truth—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy fog. Tyler's heart raced as he watched the scene unfold. He had done his part, spoken up when no one else would. Now, it was up to Mr. Langston to decide what would happen next. Would he believe the scrappy boy from the streets, or would the suited man's defense win out? The café waited, breathless, for what would come next. The café erupted into chaos. Voices overlapped, blending disbelief, whispers, and gasps. Tyler stood firm, though his small frame seemed almost lost in the crowd. His voice, though shaky, carried an undeniable conviction. "I saw what I saw," Tyler repeated, pointing directly at the man in the sharp suit. "He put something in the cup." The suited man's face twisted in frustration. "This is absurd," he barked. "I don't know this kid, and I certainly didn't touch anything." Mr. Langston remained upright, his expression unreadable. He calmly stirred his coffee, not to drink it, but as if to make a point. "Enough," he said, his deep voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Let's settle this here and now." The billionaire turned his sharp gaze toward Tyler, then back to the accused man. "If you've done nothing wrong," he said, his tone steady but firm, "then you won't mind proving it." The man's confidence wavered. "Prove what?" he asked, attempting a weak laugh. "You want me to, what? Empty my pockets? This is ridiculous. I'm not entertaining this nonsense." Now, let's pause here for a second. If someone asked you to empty your pockets and you knew you were innocent, wouldn't you do it in a heartbeat? That's exactly why the crowd began to turn on him. The cafe patrons weren't buying his act. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. "What's the harm if you've got nothing to hide?" someone said, loud enough for the man to hear. Tyler took a small step forward, his voice growing steadier. "If you didn't do anything, it should be easy to prove," he said simply. "Just empty your pockets." The suited man's face flushed deep red, beads of sweat now visible on his forehead. "This is harassment," he snapped, trying to sound outraged but failing to mask his growing panic. Mr. Langston stood up slowly, his imposing presence making the man take a step back. "You heard the boy," Langston said, his tone as cold as steel. "Empty your pockets." The room held its collective breath as the man hesitated, his hand hovering near his jacket. For a moment, it seemed like he might refuse outright. But under the weight of dozens of piercing stares and the billionaire's unyielding glare, he relented. With trembling hands, he reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a small glass vial. It was no larger than a lipstick tube, filled with a clear, viscous liquid. The cafe fell silent. Even the clatter of plates and coffee cups seemed to pause in the air. Tyler's eyes locked onto the vial, his instincts screaming that this was exactly what he'd seen. Now, imagine trying to play innocent while holding the literal smoking gun. Or in this case, the suspicious vial. It's like watching someone claim they don't like sweets while holding a chocolate bar. Mr. Langston didn't waste a second. He gestured toward a security guard who had quietly stepped inside during the commotion. "Take that," Langston instructed, nodding toward the vial. The man stumbled over his words, trying to explain. It's nothing. Just a harmless supplement," he said, but his voice cracked under pressure. Tyler shook his head. "Supplements don't get poured into someone's drink in secret," he said, his words cutting through the man's excuse like a knife. Mr. Langston leaned in close to the man, his voice low and threatening. "Let me make this clear," he said. "You tried to poison me, and now you're going to explain exactly why." The cafe crowd erupted into hushed whispers again, their attention glued to the unfolding drama. Tyler, though still nervous, felt a small flicker of relief. For the first time, he wasn't invisible. But even as the security guard stepped in to detain the man, Tyler couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over yet. Something about the whole scene felt bigger than just one cup of coffee. The real story was only beginning. The tension in the cafe was so thick, it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. Mr. Langston turned to the cafe manager and, with calm authority, said, "Call the police immediately." The manager, wide-eyed and shaking, nodded before rushing to the phone. While everyone waited, the cafe staff carefully examined the cup and its contents. Using a simple test kit they kept for emergencies, they confirmed what Tyler had feared. It contained a dangerous, fast-acting poison. Gasps rippled through the room as the news spread. Across the room, the sharp-suited man's composure shattered. He glanced toward the door, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. Then, in a flash, he bolted, shoving a chair aside. But the patrons had been watching closely, and they weren't about to let him get away. Two burly men stood up, blocking his path. "Not so fast," one of them said firmly, arms crossed like a human barricade. Another patron grabbed the door handle, making sure the would-be escape route stayed sealed. The man in the suit spun around, desperate for another way out, but it was clear he had no chance. The police arrived moments later, their sirens slicing through the tense silence outside. Officers entered the cafe, their presence bringing a sense of relief to the crowd. Without putting up much of a fight, the sharp-suited man was apprehended, his head hanging in defeat. As the officers secured him, one leaned over to inspect the vial. "This isn't just poison," the officer muttered. "It's something far worse, professionally made." Tyler stood near the back, silent and wide-eyed. His trembling hands gripped the edge of a table as the adrenaline began to wear off. He felt the weight of every eye in the room. Whispers filled the air, some in awe of his courage, others wondering how he'd noticed something no one else had. Finally, Mr. Langston approached him, his imposing figure softened by the gratitude etched into his face. He placed a firm but gentle hand on Tyler's shoulder. "You just saved my life," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. Tyler blinked up at him, his expression a mix of relief and disbelief. "I just did what I thought was right," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. Langston crouched slightly to meet the boy at eye level. "What you thought was right," he said, his voice steady, "took courage most people don't have. You acted when others froze. That's something no amount of money can buy." The cafe patrons began to clap, hesitant at first, then building into a full round of applause. Tyler flushed red, unsure how to react. He wasn't used to attention, let alone being celebrated. Isn't it funny how heroes often don't see themselves as heroes? Tyler thought he was just doing the bare minimum, but everyone else knew better. As the commotion died down and the police prepared to leave with the detained man, Mr. Langston stayed by Tyler's side. "I want to hear your story," he said kindly. "Why don't we sit down for a proper meal? You've more than earned it." For the first time in what felt like forever, Tyler smiled. A genuine, unguarded smile. Little did he know, this day would mark the beginning of a new chapter in his life. One where he'd no longer be invisible. But even as the cafe returned to normal, one question lingered in Mr. Langston's mind. Who sent the man in the suit, and why? He knew this incident was only the tip of the iceberg. The story wasn't over yet. In fact, it was just getting started. After the dramatic events at the cafe, something changed in Mr. Langston. It wasn't just about the life he'd been saved from. Something about Tyler's courage and quick thinking left a lasting impression. He didn't just offer a thank you, he wanted to do more. A few days later, Mr. Langston reached out to Tyler, inviting him to meet at his office. Tyler was nervous. He'd never been inside such a big building, let alone meet someone of Mr. Langston's stature. But when they sat down together, it was clear this wasn't a typical business meeting. "I see potential in you," Mr. Langston said, his voice calm and sincere. "You've got a sharp mind, a sense of intuition that most people don't have. You noticed something everyone else missed." Tyler didn't know what to say. The boy who once wandered the streets, invisible to most people, was now being seen for who he truly was. He could hardly believe the words coming from Mr. Langston. Tell me, Tyler, Mr. Langston continued, how would you like a fresh start? The question hung in the air. Tyler's eyes immediately filled with tears, a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming gratitude. For years he'd been fighting just to survive, and now someone was offering him the chance to live, to thrive. Tyler wiped his eyes, his voice shaky. I don't know what to say, he murmured. You don't have to say anything right now, Mr. Langston replied, but I want to help. You've been through a lot. It's time for you to have the future you deserve. True to his word, Mr. Langston made sure Tyler had the resources he needed. He enrolled Tyler in a school, making sure he received proper education and mentorship. No more fighting for scraps or wondering where his next meal would come from. He had a roof over his head, a bed to sleep in, and a world of opportunities ahead of him. Over time, Tyler flourished. He worked hard, learning new skills and discovering talents he never knew he had. The shy, uncertain boy from the streets grew into a confident, driven young man. His journey was far from easy, but with Mr. Langston's support and guidance, Tyler found strength in himself he never thought possible. And their bond? It grew into something truly special. They were more than just a billionaire and a homeless kid, they were friends. Tyler didn't just have a benefactor, he had someone who believed in him, someone who cared about his future. Isn't it incredible how the smallest act of kindness can completely change someone's life? It's proof that sometimes a single moment is all it takes to set a new course. As the years passed, Tyler's future shone brighter and brighter. He started making his own way in the world, never forgetting the man who had given him a chance when no one else would. And as for Mr. Langston, he had no doubt that Tyler would go on to accomplish great things. Their friendship, unlikely as it was, became a symbol of hope, a reminder that no matter where we start, it's never too late to change our path. This story reminds us that heroes come in all shapes and sizes. It's not always the ones with capes or shiny suits who make the biggest impact. It can be someone who's been overlooked, someone who has nothing but their instincts and their will to do what's right. Tyler's story shows us that no matter where we come from, we all have the potential to be heroes. Tyler's bravery wasn't about grand gestures or showing off. It was about seeing something wrong and speaking out, even when the whole world seemed to be against him. His courage didn't just save a life, it sparked a chain of events that would change his own life forever. That moment in the café, when he shouted at the right time, was a reminder of something important. One small act of courage can shift the course of everything. What about you? What would you do if faced with a moment like this? Would you have spoken up? Would you have trusted your instincts in the way Tyler did? Let me know in the comments below. And here's the key takeaway. Sometimes the smallest voice, the one that seems to have the least power, can make the biggest difference. It's easy to think that we're too small to matter, but Tyler proved that every voice counts. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay inspired.